What's up guys, it's Ramen Noodles back with another video, this time about the state of SWG and SWG's future. There's so much to cover that I had to think long and hard about where to begin. So before I begin, I just want to let any newcomers to SWG know there are a list of acronyms and what they mean in the description of this video. With that, let's jump into it by talking about where SWGemu is currently at. It's been over a decade and a half of development, but from what I can tell, as of the making of this video, 1.0 is basically feature complete, meaning all of 1.0's features, except JTL, are done. It seems the SWGemu team just has some bugs to squash before declaring 1.0 finished. Also, speaking of JTL, they are making a ton of progress on that expansion with the help of some really great community contributors. And just like the rest of SWGemu 14.1 features, it will be fully open source when it comes out. When does it come out? I can't say. SWGemu does not release any ETAs, which totally isn't frustrating at all, let me tell ya.
Are we there yet?
No.
Are we there yet?
No.
But what about other SWG projects? What's going on with them? Well, there's the source code servers, the most popular of which is Legends. I've played Legends in the past, and maybe if they implemented something that really interests me, I'll play in the future. But currently, I have no interest in doing so. There's also SWG Restoration 3. I guess minus the 3 now because they eventually figured out that having 3 in the name makes people question what happened to the first 2 servers. While originally it was supposed to be a CU server, it is now something very different and not to my tastes. Mix those changes in with some broken promises and the server has completely turned me off. There's also the Core 3 servers. For new viewers who don't know what Core 3 is, that's the open source code SWGemu has been working on to emulate pre-CU SWG. Anybody with the know-how can take the code and spin up their own server. Quite a few people have done this, and some have made major modifications and overhauls to the game to create a new experience. Some of these, in my opinion, are very good, like Empire in Flames, which is geared towards role players, yet has some of the coolest systems and immersive content I have ever seen in SWG, for role players, PvPers, and PvEers. Seriously, it's worth a try. Another Core 3 server that has my attention right now is Stardust. Stardust is another majorly overhauled server that sought to bring balance to the game and make every combat profession viable, while also making combat a bit quicker and adding a bunch of new content. It's actually very impressive, and I'm most likely going to make a video about it later. Before I continue on what I believe will be SWG's future, I want to address a couple of phrases I commonly hear.
I wish there weren't all these servers splitting the population. We need everyone on one server to have a healthy population.
It's easy to see why people would think or say this. Having everyone on one server would make the game feel alive, even if the mechanics of the game suck. However, the problem isn't that there are too many SWG servers. The problem is that there's no reigning king SWG server everyone flocks to. While developers, for all the servers I've mentioned thus far, are not profiting off their projects, they still want people to play them because, like you, they want a populated server that feels alive. However, not everyone who creates a server actually deals with the massive issues that are prevalent in SWG, some of which were problems in live from launch till SWG's eventual death. This is why there should be multiple servers. There should be multiple takes on how the game should be. What will eventually happen is that the server with the best systems and mechanics will rise to the top, but more on that later.
What's the population?
Another phrase that, in my opinion, is the wrong approach to the emulator scene. Yes, population matters, but if the mechanics sound appealing to you, you should just play it. I know this message will go far because I'm pretty sure this is the hang-up for most people. If everyone who asked, "What's the population?" just went ahead and played, who knows what server would be booming right now. Now that I've addressed those two phrases, let's talk about actual population. Why I believe the population is the way it is on the major servers, why there is a population split, and why I believe there is room for massive growth within the SWG community. Taking a quick look at the active populations, SWGemu and Restoration -3 seem to be averaging around 250 concurrent players, while Legends normally has over 1,000. I know SWGemu and Restoration do not count characters on the server, but active accounts. I am unsure if Legends is counting accounts or characters logged in, as they allow 3 online at once, but I will say when I log in, I see a ton of AFKers, as the NGE has just as much reason to AFK in the game as pre-CU does. But even despite that, I still see a lot of players running around and playing the game actively. I cannot speak to the populations of Empire in Flames or Stardust, as those numbers aren't publicly available at a moment's notice like the big three are. So why does Legends have such a big population? Well, to start, the NGE was the longest running combat system during SWG's lifetime. And while I am more than certain SWG's population peaked during pre-CU, the NGE came nowhere near the amount of subscribers SWG had during its peak. There were still a lot of players that came and went in the NGE's 6-year lifespan. On top of that, the later half of the NGE was a much better game than the first half. NGE at launch was, without a doubt, in my mind, the worst patch any game has ever had, ever. If streamers and YouTubers existed back then like they do now, it would have undoubtedly gone viral.
Added a new system into the game that's completely unnecessary. This is a meaningful choice. I think a lot of the meaningful choices people are making whenever they see changes like this are the choice not to play the fucking game. This is so stupid. I can't believe it. So let's go ahead and look at it.
But despite its terrible launch, over the years, which I realize that sounds absolutely awful, the NGE actually became what I would consider a decent game. The end of NGE was a game with far more content and less balance issues than pre-CU had, considering the NGE had 6 years of development at the end, and pre-CU only had 4.5-ish total. On top of the NGE being more developed, Legends themselves has added a whole lot of content. New instances, new boss fights, new collections, more space, a whole new planet, which is done really well, tons of cosmetics, lots of PvP content, Farmville, and so forth. Overall, for what the NGE is, Legends has done mostly right by it. But why is it not the server everyone flocks to? Well, I'll get into the problems a little later. For now, let's talk about Restoration 3. Now, if you've been following me for a while, you'll know I used to be crazy for Resto. Like, I love that server. I made videos, I streamed it, I brought friends, and we did testing, research to see how the CU was supposed to work, and in constant communication with the dev team. Resto had a rough day one launch, but regularly peaked at over 800 concurrent players for a while after. There were certain things I didn't like, but I didn't mind, as it was the only server striving to be the combat upgrade version of SWG, with the CU being my favorite iteration of the game. Unfortunately, as time went on, it drifted further and further from what it was originally supposed to be. On top of that, some of the bigger ideas never really quite landed, like the server progression system, which got delayed, and then once released ended up being a big mess, with content being gated way longer than it should have been. The game feels kind of like a mix of NGE and CU, as they even use a modified NGE client. Also, 2 years after launch, and still no Jedi. But hey, at least they have drag queens, and changed some names around the professions to exclude man.
Seems kinda gay.
On top of all that, Restoration runs a dishonest campaign to rope people into playing their server. Restoration's PR team tells a whole lie about how Restoration is reviving or bringing back SWG.
Now, okay, here's what's cool. Star Wars Galaxies. Somebody in chat just said Star Wars Galaxies, right? There is currently a push for Star Wars. They are remaking Star Wars Galaxies in like a new thing. Those that haven't heard this, we talked about this earlier today. Star Wars Galaxies is being kind of like brought back. You'll have to talk about that later. But yeah, I'm still getting the details and stuff, but there's like Star Wars Galaxies is quasi being brought back from what I understand, which is cool.
Yeah, so Restoration isn't reviving or bringing back SWG. I don't know why they try to tell people that, but it's obvious it's coming from the Restoration team, as Sniper reaches out to content creators and I guess journalists in order to promote the server. And I don't blame content creators for not being aware of the SWG emulation scene. It's not their fault the first they hear of it is from people lying about their project. Now, there's nothing wrong with promoting the server, but to lie and say they are resurrecting SWG, well, that's just objectively and verifiably false. Restoration uses a modified version of the NGE client and leaked source code. They are not the first to do this, as this is what Legends has been doing for years. Not to mention the first SWG Emulator project, which in my opinion still has the biggest brand name, is SWG Emu, which started in 2006 and is still going strong today. For Restoration to portray itself like this paints a dishonest picture of the actual SWG landscape. Despite having the most aggressive advertising of all the servers, as in they're pretty much the only server that does advertisements, and having actual big updates to the server, they still hover around 250 concurrent players on average when I check on them. Whatever they're doing, it doesn't seem to be working to grow their population. Speaking of 250 concurrent players on average, it's time to talk about the big dog, the one that started it all, SWGemu.
Have you forgotten the laws upon which Narnia was built?
Do not cite the deep magic to me, witch. I was there when it was written.
When Finalizer, the current playtest server for SWGemu, first launched, it was regularly peaking at over 1,500 players. And what an incredible experience that was. The beginning of a fresh pre-CU server is truly wonderful. Nobody has mastered anything yet. Crafters are organizing with their guilds to delegate who is harvesting what resource the different crafting professions need. Some, like myself, start off by mastering Terras Kasi because of its innate damage and high toughness. And after that, we rushed doing theme parks and POIs with our puny X-31 land speeders so that we could get to the village and unlock Jedi. It was challenging, it was grueling, and yet it was the best time to play Star Wars Galaxies. So how did an SWG server that was regularly peaking at over 1,500 players fall off to 250? Did the devs make a change everyone hated? Is the community so toxic it forced a bunch of people to quit? Did the devs give up? Thankfully, no. Lord Cater actually gave us some insight to this as per his data analysis. 90% of players quit after the first 90 days. Why is that? Why is it that 90% of players quit after 90 days? Well, if you're an MMORPG veteran, you probably already know. A lack of endgame content. SWGemu's stated goal for many years has been to replicate patch 14.1 of live SWG. Now, whatever you think of 14.1, God knows I hate it, there has to be a goal for a project like this in order to avoid scope creep. And it seems that after 20 years of pre-CU, people understand that maybe SWG pre-CU wasn't all it cracked up to be. The rose-tinted nostalgia goggles have come off for a lot of people. Even though the game is a sandbox and you're supposed to create your own content, goals most players will set are easily achieved and don't lead to a long-lasting relationship with the game. Predictably, the SWGemu population has fallen off hard despite some nice quality of life updates and a tad bit more content. But does that mean SWG is destined to have the only server with a decent population being Legends? No, I don't think so. In fact, I think the population of Legends could be surpassed with a server done right. Let me talk about some of the issues with Legends like I promised I would earlier. First off, the client for the NGE is perhaps the worst of the three eras. PvP is a lag fest that I can't get around. The new planet, Bespin, that Legends put in also lags just walking around it. It's not the fault of the Legends team that a 2003 game lags so badly in 2023, but I haven't seen anything that's going to fix it. Secondly, the economy on Legends is a disaster. One of the major draws to SWG was crafting, and crafters were kept employed by the fact that everything in SWG was essentially a consumable. Your armor and weapons would decay until they eventually broke, then you would have to replace them completely. The only things that didn't decay and break were pets, droids, and structures, which is arguably an oversight on SOE's part. One of the very first things the NGE did was turn off decay. Once you had the best set of armor and weapons, there was no reason to replace them, which creates stagnation in the economy. You would need a constant influx of new players in order to steadily sell armor and weapons. For other games like World of Warcraft, that isn't a big deal because crafting is more of a side thing. But in SWG, crafting is a whole game on its own. There are players that don't ever touch combat. All they do is craft, because the crafting side of the game is complex and rewarding, and the game is designed in such a way that crafting could be the only thing you ever know if that's what you wanted to play. It's literally one of the 9 professions in the NGE. Picking it basically opts you completely out of combat. Counting on SWG's developers and marketing team to provide you with a constant stream of new customers was not a good idea.
Now, to tell you a little bit about me, I'm 52 years old, and I'm a lifelong gamer, and I've had depression for my entire career.
The other economic issue Legends faces, but was actually a problem for the entirety of SWG's lifespan, no matter what era it was, is inflation. The truth is that SWG's economy was not very well balanced for the credit sinks it had, and over time more and more credits entered the game, never to be thrown out into the abyss. The NGE actually made this problem far worse by drastically increasing the amount of credits you would loot off NPCs, and I guess because SOE was smoking some wild stuff, actually decreased the cost of maintenance for buildings and cities. Higher inflation makes it harder for new players to get started, and I seriously don't envy the Legends team for the nightmare that is trying to solve the economy problem without alienating the current player base. The only way I could see something like that being fixed is taking care of the issues that cause inflation and spinning up a new server. And the last reason I don't think Legends will be the go-to server, and this is purely my opinion extrapolated from a few true facts, is that it uses the source code. For those who aren't familiar with the SWG scene, the code that ran the live game leaked some years ago. At least the 2010 version of SWG did, and that's what Legends has been using. Now technically, that's illegal. However, I am convinced that Disney does not give a flying chuba about that, and maybe I'll make a video on why I think that later, but for right now, some devs might have an aversion to doing something technically illegal. It means if I'm wrong, and it turns out that somehow Disney really doesn't know about the source code servers, and finds out about them one day, they can issue a cease and desist and all their hard work will be gone. To add to that, from my personal experience, there have been way more drastic changes to Core 3 than there have been to the source code. Yes, Legends added Bespin, yes, they added farming, and yes, they added new instances and bosses, but there are currently 3 projects that have huge overhauls to Core 3 combat. Those being Empire in Flames, Stardust, and yet to be mentioned in this video, SWG Emu. Compare that to the one server that has majorly overhauled the source code, Restoration. This inclines me to believe that developers are more willing to work with Core 3 rather than the source. I don't know exactly all the reasons for that, I'm just relaying what I've observed. So what is the future of SWG? Will it be populated? Let's look a little bit at the past and some other projects, and then I want to talk about some of the things I think will be necessary for a Core 3 server to succeed. I did a lot of thinking about what would be comparable to SWG, what the potential for the SWG private server population could be like, and that led me to Ultima Online. Ultima Online has several private servers, most of which I found do not display their concurrent player numbers. However, there is one that will post their peak numbers on a more regular basis, and that server is UO Outlands. Now, I don't play UO, so I can't really speak to the changes UO Outlands have done, nor do the specifics really matter for the point I am trying to make. UO is an MMO that came out 6 years before SWG did, in 1997. UO Outlands regularly peaks at over 2,500 concurrent players. That is an insane number for a game that, well, looks like UO does. Outdated graphics, outdated gameplay, but people still eat it up and they love it. How does that compare to UO when it was live? Well, thankfully I found the screenshot floating around the UO community of a GM tool that would tell GMs how many players are online per server. The date is set for December 11th, 1999, around 2 p.m. on a Saturday. What time zone? I'm unsure. But one thing we can count on is Saturday being a good day to see peak player populations. As you can see from the screenshot, the highest player count is on a server called Ararang, coming in at 1848 concurrent players. That means that the players of UO Outlands are getting an experience that was similar or better than the live servers. But what about SWG's numbers? Unfortunately, we don't have numbers related to pre-CU or the CU, but we do have numbers from a single Friday night 3 months after the NGE launched. As you can see, the population was very low on most servers, with Bria jumping way ahead of everyone else, 722 concurrent players. My server, Loca, was sitting at 227, and I'm not surprised, as that is exactly how it felt right after the NGE. That said, my guesstimation is that at least 75%, if not more, of the population quit after NGE launch. The game became a coast town overnight for most servers. Now, Lord Cater of SWGemu has said it is a well-known fact that live servers capped at 3K players. I don't know where he got those numbers from, but I think it's reasonable to believe most servers had 1K to 1.5K plus players, with exceptions for Bria and the other big servers. Now, most of you veterans who played live and played SWGemu probably feel that something isn't right here. You have played SWGemu when it had 1K plus players, and you didn't think it was as active as your live server was. How can that be? Well, I think the answer is simple. It is my personal belief that as time has gone on, AFKing has become more prevalent. 20 years ago, people had way worse internet and computers. It wasn't viable for everyone to leave their computer on 24/7 entertainer dancing or harvesting resources. On top of that, we were limited to one toon per account, so people like myself, who never had an Ent or a Crafter, never had a reason to do so. That means that the people who were online back in the live days were people actively playing the game, and thus made the game feel way more alive than in SWGemu, where AFKing is a very prevalent thing for doctors, entertainers, crafters, and loot campers. If a game like Ultima Online, which is pretty dated, can pull over 2,500 concurrent players on a regular basis, what is the potential for SWG, which is also dated, but less so than UO? In my humble opinion, I could see an SWG server done right pulling in 4,000 to 5,000 players. Call me optimistic, call me delusional, but SWG has so much untapped potential. The real problems with the game are fixable, and what the game does well, it does extremely well, and is yet to be replicated by any MMO in existence, like the crafting and player city systems.
And to this day, across these fan-run servers, there's still thousands of active users. If Galaxies were a title today running on Steam, it would have enough active users to be in the top 100 online games on Steam, even now.
That's Raph Koster. He's SWG's dad, and he's also UO's dad. He seems to be the guy who created one of the best crafting and housing systems ever, then pieced out because the rest of the game was a disaster. I know that because he said just as much on the SWGemu forums 10 years ago.
I'm gonna get a smoke.
Alright, so we've established that SWG Pre-CU has some problems. The following is an objective look at how the systems that I believe need changing work and my opinion as to why they're bad. Let's start with ham. No, not that kind of ham. This kind of ham. Health, action, and mind. This thing has several problems and I'm going to point them all out to you. The first issue will be immediately noticeable to new players. Every weapon in the game has a special attack cost, or SAC. This SAC is usually pretty high with a lot of weapons, and using abilities will drain your ham. Why is this a problem? Because if any of your ham bars reach 0, you will be incapacitated and possibly deathblown. Combat over, see ya in the cloner. So to put this in terms normal people who play normal games can understand, you spend your health to attack things. And it's not even like a cool vampiric kind of mechanic where you're sucking your opponent's HP to add to your own. No, you're just draining your health in order to drain your opponent's health. So how do you deal with that? Well, each ham bar has 2 secondary stats, one for regeneration and one to lower the SAC of your abilities. You need a doctor to buff all your health and action stats, and an entertainer to buff your mind. Doing so will essentially get rid of your special attack cost, allowing you to attack for free. Which leads us to our second issue. You have to do this every time you log in if you want to do any combat whatsoever. It's tedious, it's a chore, and honestly, it's just a relic of the past. If you're someone with a job and a family, you're gonna feel it cutting into your playtime. I'm sure someone is hearing this right now and about to go off in the comments about interdependence, socialization, economy, and whatever else old Pops designed the game around. Here's the thing, you can keep the interdependence of SWG without having to get buffed to do literally anything in the game. I don't visit a chef every time I log in, but I still need the buffs from food. That's why I'm criticizing Doctor and Entertainer and not Chef. Chef is a well-designed class that is necessary and useful, but I can stock up on food and eat them at any time. Not so with Entertainers and Doctors. But we're not done with the ham system yet. There's a few more things for me to still harp on. One of those being armor. Armor has something called encumbrance, which means that equipping a piece of armor takes away from your current ham secondary stats, lowering your regen and increasing your special attack cost. However, buffs are so high that almost nothing changes and you still get to attack for free. But if you were unbuffed, you'd be unaliving yourself faster than SWG did with the NGE. If this encumbrance didn't exist, it might be viable to do some combat without buffs. In fact, I really can't think of any games that punish you for wearing armor. I get where the original system was going with it, that wearing heavier armor was supposed to come with a penalty, a trade-off for big damage reduction, but it's ended up so that everyone uses the exact same set of armor, leaving all other armor sets in the game to be basically useless. It needs to be completely reworked. The next problem is a pretty straightforward and simple one. Health and action are redundant. Whether you die to health or you die to action, it doesn't matter. When you heal both of them. If an attack doesn't target a specific pool, it's going to hit health more times than action, and action more times than mind. So all action really does is slow the time to kill on everything. It's not the biggest issue, but I thought it was worth pointing out. Alright, the last issue with ham before we get off this whole ham business. The mind bar. I won't even crack a joke yet, I'll just explain it to you and it will be immediately obvious what the issue is. Mind cannot be healed by the vast majority of combat players. The only people that can heal their own mind is Jedi, and for good reason really. Combat medics and some Jedi can heal other people's mind, but at a pretty significant cost that doesn't make it sustainable. The icing on the cake is that the two highest damage classes in the game, Rifleman and Swordsman, both have multiple attacks that hit mind specifically. If you're pretty much any other class and you come across either of those two, you're probably done for. Not that I care about 1v1s in a game about war, but it doesn't make it any less of a terrible mechanic. Dying to mind does not feel good, especially when you can't drain their mind like they do yours. It makes you feel helpless and it makes you feel like you chose the wrong class. Because you did! SOE was surely sipping on some stupid juice when they made the decision to make the mind bar the way it is. With all that said, ham is an issue. Any future server that wants to be taken seriously, in my opinion, will have to rework the ham system. It's not well thought out and it feels bad to play against. I can see it being an instant turnoff for new players. Speaking of not good for newcomers, let me ask you veteran players a couple questions. What is the % chance for a melee attack to miss you if you have 100 melee defense? How often can you resist Dizzy with 50 points of defense versus Dizzy? For the people who don't play SWG, none of the vets know. You know why they don't know? Because the game doesn't explain it in the slightest bit. Not only that, but these defenses are relative to the abilities and the stats of the person attacking you. But you wouldn't even know that from playing the game, because again, it never explains it. SWG Pre-CU desperately needs to explain how the game works. The NGE, weirdly enough, actually fixed this issue. You can go to your stat sheet and see what % chance you have to do literally anything. In Pre-CU, you just have a bunch of numbers without any sort of explanation as to how they work. Number high? Good. Number low? Bad.
So me think, why waste time? Say lot word when few word do trick.
Speaking of numbers, there's a bunch of extra numbers that don't do anything. Stats that are in the game that do absolutely nothing. Leadership? What the hell does that do? Nothing. How about heavy weapon speed? Sounds like it would work, for heavy weapons. Nope, nothing. Whatever future servers come along need to make sure the game can explain itself and not bait whatever potential new players there are into caring about stats that don't even work. Next up, whoever works on a future server needs to understand the entire, and I do mean entire, game is PvP.
Wait a minute, you're just saying that because you're a PvP player.
No, I'm saying that because that's how the game actually is. Like PvE, for example. The group or person who does most of the damage gets loot rights to the mob killed, which has led to some intense conflicts of two groups DPS racing over a single mob for some of the best loot in the game. Entertainers position themselves in front of the cantinas in order to get the most customers. In fact, I remember during early Finalizer there was big drama over entertainers and where they positioned themselves. The ones at the front took all the business from the ones in the back. Doctors try to squeeze out the best buffs they can craft in order to attract more customers than other doctors. The biggest PvPers are actually crafters, merchants, and resource gatherers. Resource gatherers need to find the highest concentration of currently great resources and then be the first to plop down a whole bunch of harvester machinery on top of it. Then crafters want those resources, so they either are also a resource gatherer or they buy the resources and try to produce the best products they can with it. Crafters might also be merchants and sell their stuff on in-game vendors. But you want not only the best products to sell, you also want the best location so players would find your vendor. Maybe not as much anymore with vendor search being implemented into the game. Old Dad says that vendor search made regular folks like myself happy because we could easily find what we were looking for, but it made half the merchants in the game quit because essentially having a great location or ease of access was not good enough anymore. It had a centralizing effect on a game that was designed around a decentralized market. According to the great Baba of SWG, vendor search caused one of the greatest subscriber drops in SWG history. One of the greatest pieces of content on Finalizer was the Chef Wars. Early on, Greedy Slug, Cake Farts, and Mini Nolan were competing against each other on the food and drink market. It's normal for crafters to compete, but what made it way more entertaining was the fact that Cake Farts, aka Tim Allen, was streaming the vast majority of it. All sorts of trash talk and trolling was going on.
Some people say they're overpriced, but they're just jealous that they can't do it like me!
It was awesome. So yeah, the entire game is PvP. Almost like there's some sort of galactic civil war going on or something. An empire divided, not an empire united. Hopefully, that competitive spirit isn't lost on current or future servers. Since we're talking about crafting classes, let me add something about the combat classes. Class and build diversity in pre-CU is very limited. I know some of you right now are going to be like, oh my god, how can you say that? There's over 30 classes in the game. What are you smoking? Let me explain. The things worth killing in this game hate most of the combat classes, meaning you either pick swordsman or rifleman to kill everything that's not a crate dragon, and then if you want to kill crate dragons, you pick commando. That's pretty much the gist of it. Crate dragons, of course, were not originally designed to be soloed, but you know, SWG is a broken game. There's absolutely no reason to bring the vast majority of classes to fight high-end mobs. There's virtually nothing to contribute except damage, but why even contribute damage to a group when you can just solo everything yourself? This limits class diversity when it comes to PvE. It's not exactly the same in PvP. There are classes that lend themselves to being PvP viable without insane gear like combat medic, rifleman, swordsman, fencer, and Jedi, but the rest of them do require way above average gear, like legendary or exceptional weapons, which to you who are watching this, yes, the collective you will never obtain that sort of gear. It's literally just too rare, and saying X, Y, or Z class is viable if they have legendary or exceptional weapons is just not an argument when the game needs to cater to those who like to theory craft and diversify their builds. One of the most hated things about the NGE was how they deleted so many classes and took the game from 30 plus down to 9. Ironically, there's more build and class diversity in the NGE than there is in pre-CU, at least when it comes to viability in PvP and high-end PvE. So whatever future servers come up need to give reason for all classes to be played, and it doesn't necessarily have to be about damage either. I have one more point I want to talk about as far as crafting goes. Resource inflation. For those who aren't aware of SWG's crafting system, resources in the game have complete RNG stats on them with RNG names. Each resource is in the game for a relatively short amount of time, usually a week or two, then stop spawning, and then new resources start spawning with different RNG stats and names again. This leads to some really interesting gameplay where there will be a server best resource for certain items to come into spawn and cause a mad dash to go farm those resources as quickly and as efficiently as possible. It's honestly a great mechanic. The problem with this is that over time, the likelihood of a new server best resource becomes lower and lower. This hurts new players who are interested in crafting, and it kills the competitive nature of the game. That needs to change somehow. I really don't have a solution in mind because I haven't thought too much about it, but future servers need to learn the importance of this and do something to let new players compete with old players. Nothing says bad game design like telling new players they'll never be as good as older players. The final thing I believe SWG needs is endgame content and long-term character progression. These are two things really, but they're related. Currently, pre-CU SWG doesn't have much endgame content, with the little endgame content it does have being tied to gearing. Gearing is a problem in two ways. One, to get really good components for crafted weapons is not too terribly hard for the classes that are actually viable. So if your goal is to get a great weapon, it won't be extending your playtime that much longer. Two, to get a legendary or exceptional weapon that is actually worth it and be used by a class that you actually want to play is virtually impossible. So either you have a short-term goal or a goal that is impossible to reach for 99.9999999% of players. So how can this be remedied? Well, that's where character progression comes in. I believe something needs to be added beyond the current skill trees for characters to progress. A long, arduous grind to make your character more powerful in some aspect while adding to the diversity of skills pre-NGE Star Wars Galaxies is loved for. This can come in different forms, like skills beyond mastery of your chosen class, or maybe new unlockable classes that aren't Jedi. Really lean into the whole you are a citizen of the galaxy and can be anything you want feel. Not to mention, balancing skills will be a much easier task than balancing gear. Many people complain about vanilla XP rates, so they play other SWG servers that either have a very tiny player base or die very quickly. SWG is not a particularly grindy game in comparison to other MMOs of its day, or even compared to MMOs now. Boosting XP rates without any more meaningful grinds added to the game just kills servers faster. While it's true none of the SWG servers are using a subscription model, you still still need players to grind for goals or else they'll run out of things to do. Obviously, endgame content outside of just more skills and professions matters too. More quests, more boss mobs to kill, more things to craft, more resources to gather, more pets to tame, more everything. I'm all for it. Also, SWG Emu is making really good progress on JTL. I look forward to seeing more JTL content. Personally, I want to see capital ships, player-owned space stations, raiding and boarding parties, conflict, more space classes, more spaceships, more space abilities, more space parts, and so on and so forth. Another thing I think would be good for servers is seasonal content, but I think it needs to be something either grindy or challenging and have good rewards, or people will do it quickly and get bored or just not log in for it at all. And that's pretty much it for the list of what I think needs done. I think some players might be concerned with too many Jedi, but that issue fixes itself if the class balance is truly addressed.
The time has come.
Also, as a side note, I think anyone who is serious about developing an SWG server and new content for it should play old school RuneScape consistently for a month. I won't elaborate in this video, but if that game can do well with how it looks and plays, so can SWG. So to wrap it all up, I believe SWG's future is bright. The game is amazing. Its systems are ahead of its time and are still ahead of today's MMOs. All it needs are developers that have a deep understanding of the game and a clear vision for its future. Some of you might be wondering if I know of any projects that might meet these goals, and the only two I really have hope for are SWGemu and CUEmu. SWGemu are the OGs. They created Core 3. The project has been alive since 2006, and in that time the devs have become aware of every little problem with SWG pre-CU. I highly doubt anything I said in this video is a surprise to them, and I'm sure there are even other issues they recognize that a lot of other players don't. The fact that they created Core 3 and understand the game so well gives them an edge in game development. CUEmu, I think, stands a chance if they continue development, because even though the CU was received poorly at the time of its launch in 2005, it fixed a lot of the issues I have on this list. It still doesn't fix everything, but it's a considerable amount, and if they're willing to mess with vanilla CU, then they could potentially fix a lot more. There's great servers like Empire and Flames and Stardust. I wouldn't be the slightest bit upset if one of those servers became the go-to SWG server. Those devs have already shown they understand quite a bit of SWG's problems and put in real work to make the game better. But who knows, maybe someone will create a server in the future that just blows everyone else out of the water. If you got this far in the video, thanks. I hope you like and subscribe. Also, this is one of those videos where people like to comment with their ideas. If there's some interesting stuff in the comments section, I'll make a video addressing those too. Until next time, peace.